Giant Apache ordered a mail-order bride, but when the obese teen arrived, the whole town burst into cruel laughter. Dust swirls down the main street, church bells toll, and boots scuff as the giant warrior lifts her into his wagon declaring, "She is his." But behind the stares and whispers, darker forces circle. The preacher thunders that their marriage is a sin. The railroad men sharpen their pens, plotting to steal his land. And the girl they mocked? She holds a voice so powerful, it could soften the hardest hearts or spark a courtroom war. Her father rides west, ready to betray her for gold. She prays for mercy, while he steels himself to fight with law instead of rage. One truth, one vow, one fragile bond stands against greed, prejudice, and shame. Will their love survive the jeers of the town, or be torn apart when the gavel falls? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the Santa Fe train depot as the afternoon crowd buzzed with anticipation. Steam hissed from the locomotive, and wheels squealed against iron rails as the train lurched to a stop. Brian stood tall among the onlookers, his dark eyes fixed on the passenger cars. His weathered hands clasped and unclasped behind his back, the only sign of his nervousness. The Apache rancher had spent weeks preparing his home for a bride, hoping for a strong woman who could handle frontier life. As passengers began filing onto the platform, his heart quickened. Then he saw her, a young girl struggling down the steps, her patched dress stretched tight across her large frame. Her round face was streaked with tears, and she clutched a small carpetbag to her chest like a shield. "That can't be her," someone in the crowd whispered. Then came the snickers. Brian's jaw tightened as he watched Ivy, this child really, look around the platform with frightened eyes. She was nothing like the hardy frontier woman he'd expected. Instead, she was barely more than a girl, trembling and lost. "Look at the size of her," a man called out. "Reckon that's why her folks shipped her west." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ivy's shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself smaller, impossible as that was. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Brian strode forward, his boots striking the wooden platform with purpose. The crowd fell silent as the tall Apache moved through them. He stopped before Ivy, who stared up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I'm Ivy," she whispered, her voice catching. "My father," he answered, "your advertisement. But I understand if you want to send me back." She dropped her gaze to her worn shoes. "He says I'm nothing but a burden." The words hung in the air as more snickers rose from the crowd. Brian studied the young woman before him, her ill-fitting clothes, her trembling hands, the defeat in her posture. In that moment, he made his choice. Without a word, he took her carpetbag in one hand. Then, with gentle strength that silenced the onlookers, he lifted Ivy as if she weighed nothing at all. She gasped, grabbing his shoulder for balance, as he carried her to his waiting wagon. "She is mine now," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet depot. "I will not send her back." He settled her carefully on the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The reins felt familiar in his hands as he clicked to his horses. They moved forward, wheels crunching through the dusty street. Ivy sat rigid beside him, her hands twisted in her lap. As they passed the general store, more townspeople stopped to stare. Brian kept his eyes forward, his back straight with dignity. Let them look. Let them whisper. He had made his choice. The sun was setting as they left the town behind, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple. In the growing quiet, Brian could hear Ivy's soft weeping. He didn't try to stop her tears or offer empty comfort. Sometimes a soul needed to cry. The wagon wheels turned steadily, taking them toward his ranch and whatever future they would build together. Brian thought of the lonely meals he'd eaten, the empty rooms he'd prepared, the hope he'd held for companionship. This wasn't what he'd expected, but he recognized something in Ivy's hurt, a mirror of his own experiences with prejudice and rejection. As evening settled around them, coyotes began their distant songs. Ivy's tears gradually quieted, though she still trembled beside him. Brian kept driving, mile after mile, choosing with each moment to stand against the humiliation the town had tried to heap upon them both. The last light painted the clouds pink and orange as his ranch came into view, a solid house, a barn, corrals for his cattle. Not grand, but his, built with his own hands. He'd made something here, carved a life from the wild land. Now he would help Ivy do the same. He watched from the corner of his eye as she took in the sight of what would be her new home. Her hands slowly unclenched in her lap, and her breathing steadied. There was a long road ahead of them both, but for now, they had made it this far. Together they would face whatever came next. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Brian set the brake and turned to Ivy, whose face was illuminated by the last rays of sunset. "Welcome home," he said simply, and meant it. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of a modest cabin, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the darkening sky. Ivy gripped the seat's edge, taking in what would be her new home, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney, several corrals spread across the yard, and horses grazing in the distance. The evening air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke. Brian helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands gentle as he steadied her. Before they could reach the cabin door, it swung open, spilling more light into the yard. A weathered Mexican man with silver-streaked hair stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Welcome home, patron," the man called out. Then his eyes fell warmly on Ivy. "And this must be the new Senora." "Ramon," Brian said. "This is Ivy. She's come a long way from Missouri." His voice held a note of protectiveness that made Ivy's heart flutter. "Ramon is my ranch hand, and the finest vaquero this side of Santa Fe." Ramon's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Bienvenida, Senora Ivy. Welcome to your new home." There was no judgment in his gaze, only kindness that made Ivy's tight shoulders relax slightly. Inside the cabin, Brian moved about the kitchen with surprising efficiency for such a large man. He stoked the cook stove and began preparing a simple supper while Ivy perched uncertainly on a wooden chair, her skirts bunched around her. "It's not much," Brian said as he worked, his voice low and steady. "Just me out here these past 8 years. Ramon helps with the cattle and horses." He set a pot of beans to warm and sliced fresh bread. "Town's half a day's ride. Most folks," he paused, measuring his words, "most folks keep their distance from an Apache rancher." Ivy watched him move about the kitchen, noting how his presence filled the space without crowding it. "You must get lonely," she ventured quietly. Brian turned to look at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "Yes," he said simply. "That's why I wrote that advertisement. Not for a servant or a decoration, but for family." When he set a bowl of beans and thick slices of bread before her, Ivy hesitated. Years of her father's cruel comments about her appetite made her stomach clench with shame. Brian seemed to sense her distress. "Food is life," he said firmly, sitting across from her with his own bowl. "Here, we don't shame what keeps us strong." He began eating, his manner matter-of-fact, giving her space to follow his lead. Slowly, Ivy lifted her spoon. The beans were well seasoned, the bread fresh and filling. She ate carefully at first, then with growing comfort as Brian showed no sign of disgust or judgment. After supper, Brian led her down a short hallway. "This is your room," he said, opening a door to reveal a small but clean chamber with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window facing east. "I'll sleep in the barn until," he cleared his throat, "until you decide if you want to stay as my wife." Ivy clutched her carpetbag closer, touched by his consideration. "Thank you," she whispered. "Sleep well," Brian said softly, closing the door. In the darkness of her new room, Ivy finally let her tears flow freely. She cried for the father who had shipped her away like unwanted freight, for the strangers who had laughed at her, and for the strange new life she never asked for. But mixed with her fears was a tiny spark of hope, kindled by Brian's quiet dignity and unexpected kindness. The crowing of roosters woke her at dawn. Ivy blinked in confusion at the unfamiliar ceiling before remembering where she was. A gentle knock sounded at her door. "Ivy?" Brian's voice came through the wood. "I'd like to show you the ranch if you're willing." She dressed quickly in her plain calico dress, smoothing her hair as best she could. Brian waited in the kitchen, 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table. He handed her one without comment, letting her warm her hands around the tin cup. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Brian led her first to the corrals, where sleek cattle lowed softly. 30 head, he explained, with more calves coming in spring. His voice held pride as he described his careful breeding program. They walked to a small building beside the main house, where Brian showed her his ledgers. "I keep careful count," he said, pointing to neat columns of numbers. "Every penny earned, every calf born, every repair needed." He glanced at her. "A ranch needs more than just muscle to survive. It needs planning, patience." The tour ended in a small orchard where young apple trees stretched their branches toward the rising sun. "Planted these 3 years ago," Brian sighed, touching a trunk gently. "They'll bear fruit soon. I believe in planning for the future." Ivy understood what he wasn't saying directly, that he had built this place not just for himself, but for a family he hoped to have. The thought made her throat tight with emotion. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, the question that had burned since yesterday spilling out. "You could have sent me back. Everyone would have understood." Brian was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his land. "I've known what it's like to be judged by appearance," he said finally. "To have people decide your worth before knowing your heart." He turned to face her fully. "I didn't advertise for beauty, Ivy. I advertised for a partner, someone to share this life with. The rest is up to you." Standing there in the growing morning light, Ivy felt something shift inside her, a small seed of belonging taking root. Her father's words still echoed in her mind, and doubt still clouded her thoughts. But here, on this quiet ranch with this unexpected man, she felt the first fragile stirrings of safety. The morning sun climbed higher as Ivy stood in Brian's cabin, surveying the dusty shelves and scattered papers. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and while Brian and Ramon worked to mend a broken corral, she decided to make herself useful. A broom found in the corner made quick work of the floor, and soon she had the main room looking more orderly. Her attention turned to the desk where Brian kept his ranch records. Papers spilled from leather folders, receipts tucked haphazardly between pages of ledgers. Ivy hesitated, not wanting to overstep, but her fingers itched to bring order to the chaos. Back in Missouri, she'd helped keep the general store's books, one of the few tasks her father had trusted her with. "Just a peek," she murmured, settling into the wooden chair. Opening the first ledger, her eyes widened. The numbers were accurate, but the organization was nonsensical. Income mixed with expenses, cattle sales jumbled with supply purchases. More concerning were the unchecked columns showing payments due from local ranchers who bought Brian's yearling calves. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of hammering as Brian and Ramon worked. Taking a deep breath, Ivy pulled out fresh paper and began to sort through the mess. The sun was low when Brian's boots sounded on the porch. Ivy looked up from her work, suddenly nervous. The desk was now arranged with neat stacks, each ledger properly balanced. Brian stopped in the doorway, taking in the changed room. His eyes moved from the swept floor to the organized desk, where Ivy sat with ink-stained fingers. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly. "I found your accounts needed," she trailed off, unsure how to continue without seeming critical. "Go on," Brian encouraged, moving closer to examine her work. "Well, you're missing payments." Ivy pointed to her calculations. 3 ranchers never paid for calves they bought last spring, and Mr. Thompson's feed store has been overcharging you for 6 months. She bit her lip, watching his face. "I wrote it all down clearly, so you can see." Brian picked up the new ledger, his expression thoughtful as he studied the neat columns. "You did this?" he asked softly. Ivy nodded, twisting her hands in her lap. "Numbers make sense to me. They're either right or wrong. They don't judge like people do." A rare smile crossed Brian's face. "You've done more than make sense of numbers, Ivy. You found money I thought was lost." He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you." Before Ivy could respond, the sound of children's voices drifted through the open window. Brian moved to look out, then turned to Ivy. "We have visitors," he said. "Children from the nearby Apache settlement often come by at sunset." Ivy's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety as she followed Brian outside. 5 children, ranging from perhaps 4 to 10 years old, stood barefoot in the yard. They fell silent at the sight of her, dark eyes curious. "This is Ivy," Brian said in Apache, then repeated in English for her benefit. "She is my wife." The youngest girl, wearing a dress patched with colorful cloth, stepped forward to stare at Ivy with frank interest. Ivy felt her face flush under the scrutiny. her bulk suddenly seeming more pronounced to cover her discomfort. Ivy began to hum, a simple lullaby her mother had sung years ago. The melody floated in the evening air, sweet and clear. The children's eyes widened, and the little girl swayed slightly to the gentle rhythm. Encouraged, Ivy added words to the tune. "Hush now, my darling, be still now and rest." The moon's on her way to put day to the test. To her amazement, the children crept closer. The oldest boy began humming along, picking up the simple melody quickly. Soon all 5 children were singing, their voices blending with hers in the gathering dusk. When the song ended, the little girl tugged at Ivy's skirt. "More," she demanded in careful English. "Please, more songs." Ivy's heart swelled as she settled onto the porch steps, the children gathering around her like eager chicks. She taught them Sweet Betsy from Pike and Beautiful Dreamer songs from her childhood that had always brought her comfort. From the corner of her eye, she saw Brian watching from the doorway, his expression soft in the fading light. Ramon had appeared too, leaning against a post with a gentle smile as he listened. The next morning, Ivy was kneading bread dough when a knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Thompson, the feed store owner's wife, standing there with her young son. "I heard you were teaching songs yesterday," Mrs. Thompson said, her earlier disdain notably absent. "Tommy here has trouble with his letters and, well," she hesitated. "They say music helps children learn." Ivy looked down at Tommy's hopeful face, then back at Mrs. Thompson. "I'd be happy to help," she said quietly. That afternoon, 3 more settler women arrived with their children. Ivy sat with them at the kitchen table, using simple songs to teach letters and numbers. The children's eager faces and the mother's grateful smiles gave her a warm feeling she'd never known before. As the women prepared to leave, Mrs. Thompson lingered. "We were wrong about you, Ivy," she said softly. "I'm sorry for how we acted." At the depot, Ivy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched them go, their children skipping ahead, still singing one of her songs. Later, as she prepared supper, Ivy caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window glass. The same full figure stared back at her, the same round face that had earned so much criticism. But now there was a glow in her cheeks, a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're good with them," Brian's voice came from behind her. "The children, I mean. And your work with the ledgers," he paused. "You bring more to this ranch than I dared hope for." Ivy turned away from the window, her hands clutching her apron. "I'm trying," she whispered, "but sometimes I still feel." She gestured at herself, unable to finish. Brian stepped closer, his presence steady and warm. "What you feel about yourself and what you truly are, those can be different things. I see a woman with a keen mind and a gentle heart. The rest?" He shrugged. "That's just the wrapping paper on a precious gift." The August sun beat down mercilessly as Brian's wagon rolled into town that Sunday morning. Ivy smoothed her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once belonged to her mother, and tried to still her trembling hands. The white wooden church stood stark against the dusty street, its bell tower reaching toward the cloudless sky. Brian helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands steady and sure. "Remember," he said softly, "you have as much right to worship here as anyone." Ivy nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Together, they climbed the worn steps to the church door. As Brian's hand touched the small of her back, she drew strength from his presence. The moment they stepped inside, all conversation ceased. Ivy felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon them as they made their way down the center aisle. The rustle of skirts and whispered comments followed in their wake. A few women pulled their children closer as Brian passed, while others simply stared. They found seats near the back, where the morning light streamed through tall windows, creating patterns on the wooden floor. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and hymnal pages filled the air, reminding Ivy of quieter Sundays back in Missouri. The preacher arose from his chair beside the pulpit, his stern face set in rigid lines. He was a tall man with graying temples and hard eyes that seemed to bore straight through Ivy as he began his sermon. "Today, brothers and sisters," he intoned, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "we shall speak of God's natural order, of how he has ordained certain boundaries that must not be crossed." Ivy's fingers tightened on her hymnal as the preacher's words grew more pointed. Though he never mentioned them by name, his meaning was clear as crystal. Those who would yoke themselves unequally, he continued, his gaze sweeping over the congregation, defy the Lord's wisdom. Like mixing wool with linen or planting two crops in the same field, such unions go against God's design. Brian sat motionless beside her, his face impassive, but Ivy felt the tension in his body. She reached over and touched his hand lightly. Drawing comfort from the warmth of his skin as the sermon drew to a close, the preacher called for scripture readers. Without fully understanding why, Ivy found herself rising to her feet. A collective intake of breath filled the church. I would like to read, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The preacher's eyebrows rose, but he could hardly refuse without causing a scene. He gestured stiffly toward the lectern. Ivy's legs felt like water as she made her way forward. The Bible lay open on the wooden stand, its pages thin and delicate beneath her fingers. She took a deep breath and began to read from the book of Ruth. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. Her voice quavered at first but grew stronger with each word. For whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. The familiar words filled the church with their ancient power. Ivy's clear voice carried the story of Ruth's devotion, of love that crossed boundaries of people and place. As she read, she felt the atmosphere in the church shift like sun breaking. Through storm clouds, when she finished, the silence held a different quality, thoughtful rather than hostile. She made her way back to her seat, aware of changed expressions on many faces. After the service, as people filed out into the bright morning, an older settler woman approached them. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though she glanced nervously around, she stopped before Ivy. That was beautifully read, dear, she whispered, pressing Ivy's hand briefly before hurrying away. The moment of warmth was short-lived. As they descended the church steps, Ivy noticed a well-dressed man watching them from the shadow of a nearby building. His suit was city-cut, expensive, and his eyes held a calculating look that made her shiver despite the heat. Who is that man? She asked Brian as he helped her into the wagon. Brian's jaw tightened as he glanced in the man's direction. Railroad agent, he said quietly. Been sniffing around these parts lately. As they pulled away from the church, Ivy heard the agent's voice carry across the street. Interesting union, he drawled to his companion. Wonder if it's even legal? Might be worth looking into. The words followed them like a shadow all the way home. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ivy finally voiced the thoughts that had been tumbling through her mind all day. I never thought I'd be useful in church, she said softly. Back home, I always tried to make myself invisible during services. Father said, she stopped, unwilling to repeat his cruel words. Brian turned to face her, his dark eyes serious in the fading light. The Creator does not make mistakes, Ivy, he said. You were sent west for a purpose greater than shame. I believe that with all my heart. A warm breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves, carrying the sweet scent of late summer. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called its evening song. Ivy looked out over the land that was becoming home, feeling the truth of Bran's words settle into her soul like a healing balm. The crisp autumn air whispered through the cottonwoods, scattering golden leaves across Brian's ranch. Morning frost decorated the fence posts, melting away under the climbing sun as Ivy made her way to the orchard. Her thick shawl kept out the chill while she gathered fallen apples into her basket. Brian worked nearby, his strong hands skillfully replacing rotted fence posts. The steady rhythm of his hammer echoed across the yard. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and a quiet understanding passed between them. These peaceful moments of shared work had become precious to them both. Best get these stored before winter sets in, Brian said, pausing to wipe his brow. He gestured toward the apple trees heavy with late fruit. Looks like a good harvest this year. Ivy smiled, remembering how uncertain she'd felt when she first arrived. Now the daily routines. OF ranch life felt as natural as breathing. I'll start cooking down the bruised ones for butter, she said. Should last us through the cold months. Together they worked through the morning, Brian lifting her on his shoulders to reach the highest branches while she plucked the remaining apples. Their laughter drifted across the autumn air, a sound that would have seemed impossible those first awkward days. As afternoon shadows lengthened, children began arriving for their evening lessons. Ivy had cleared a corner of the main room, setting up a makeshift classroom with salvaged slates and chalk. Brian watched from his ledger desk as she patiently guided small hands through their letters. "That's right, Sarah," Ivy encouraged a freckled settler's daughter. "Now try writing your whole name." The lamp cast a warm glow over their bent heads as they worked. Even some of the Apache children from the nearby settlement had begun attending, mixing freely with the settlers' young ones. Their mothers often lingered in the doorway, watching with cautious approval as their children learned to read under Ivy's gentle guidance. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their lesson. Brian opened it to find the circuit preacher standing there, his severe black coat buttoned against the wind. Behind him, the railroad agent lingered in the shadows of the porch. "We need to speak," the preacher said, his voice hard as winter. "Frost, about this arrangement of yours." Brian's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside to let them enter. Ivy quickly gathered the children, sending them home early as darkness gathered outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she stacked the slates. The preacher didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This marriage cannot stand before God or law," he declared, fixing Brian with a stern gaze. "The girl is underage. No proper license was obtained. And the mixing of," he paused, his lip curling slightly, "your people's goes against natural order." The railroad agent stepped forward, his city boots clicking on the wooden floor. "There's also the matter of your land deed, Mr. Brian," he said smoothly. "Without a legal marriage, your claim becomes questionable. The railroad has certain interests in this territory." Ivy stood frozen by the fireplace, her heart pounding. All the security she'd begun to feel seemed to crumble like autumn leaves. "I never meant," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Brian, have I ruined everything by coming here?" Brian crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking her hands in. His dark eyes held nothing but warmth as he looked down at her. "You brought me peace, not ruin," he said firmly, loud enough for their unwelcome visitors to hear. "This land was granted to me by treaty and honest purchase. No man can take it through tricks of paper." The preacher cleared his throat. The law of God speaks of love and justice," Brian interrupted, his voice steady. "Where was your law when this girl's father sold her to a stranger? Where was your concern for her age then?" He turned to face them fully, still holding Ivy's hand. "She has brought nothing but good to this land, teaching children, helping neighbors, showing kindness where others showed scorn." The railroad agent's smooth mask slipped slightly, revealing irritation. "Sentiment won't hold up in court," he said. "Expect papers within the week." He turned sharply and left, the preacher following with a last disapproving glance. After they'd gone, Ivy and Brian sat quietly at the kitchen table, the lamp casting warm shadows on their faces. Neither spoke for a long moment, listening to the autumn wind rustling through the cottonwoods outside. Finally, Ivy reached for Brian's hand. "Should we pray?" she asked softly. "For guidance?" Brian nodded, bowing his head. Together they prayed in the lamplight, their words mixing English and Apache, rising like smoke to the darkening sky. Their joined hands formed a bridge across the table, a simple gesture defying all those who would tear them apart. The lamp flickered, painting their faces in gentle light as they sat together, drawing strength from each other's presence. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song through the trees, carrying winter's first whispers across the land they both now called home. The first snow of winter settled like powdered sugar across the mesas, turning the rugged landscape into a pristine wonderland. Inside Brian's cabin, warmth and savory aromas filled every corner as Ivy stirred a large pot of stew simmering over the hearth. She had learned to blend Mexican spices from Ramon with traditional frontier cooking, creating something uniquely her own. The cabin door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air along with 3 of their closest neighbors, their cheeks ruddy from the biting wind. Among them was Sarah Miller, one of the settler women who had initially scorned Ivy but now regularly sought her company. "Something smells mighty fine in here," Sarah said, stamping snow from her boots. "We were mending fences nearby and could hardly resist following our noses." Ivy's face brightened as she ladled generous portions into earthenware bowls. "There's plenty for everyone. Brian always says food tastes better shared." The visitors gathered around the well-worn table, warming their hands on the hot bowls. Steam rose in gentle curls as they spooned up tender chunks of beef, beans, and vegetables seasoned with chilies and sage. "This here's better than any stew I've tasted," declared old Mr. Peterson, who had once been among their harshest critics. Now he was a regular visitor, drawn by both Ivy's cooking and her gentle way with his grandchildren Dot as they ate. Two young Apache girls, Brian's nieces, slipped in through the back door. They had been teaching Ivy their language, patient with her stumbling attempts to wrap her tongue around unfamiliar sounds. "Dagati." Ivy greeted them carefully, using the afternoon welcome they had taught her. The girls beamed, delighted by her effort. The older girl, Morning Star, settled beside Ivy. "Today we teach you songs," she said in careful English. "Winter songs of our people." The settler women watched with curious interest as Morning Star began a soft melody, her voice clear as mountain water. Ivy listened intently, then attempted to follow along, her pronunciation awkward but earnest. "You have a gift for languages," Sarah observed, surprising everyone by adding, "Perhaps you could teach us some words too?" The afternoon passed in a warm blur of shared food and halting language lessons, laughter bridging the gaps between cultures. As the short winter day drew to a close, their visitors departed with full bellies and lighter hearts. When Brian returned from checking the cattle, Ivy met him with news of the impromptu gathering. "They're beginning to see past their fears," she said hopefully. Even Mrs. Miller asked to learn Apache words. Brian's dark eyes crinkled with pride. "You build bridges without even trying, my wife. It's your greatest gift." As Christmas approached, the town buzzed with preparation for the annual gathering. Snow continued to dust the landscape, transforming the frontier town into something almost magical. The church stood decorated with pine boughs and candles, ready for the evening's celebration. Ivy's heart fluttered with nervous energy as she and Brian entered the packed church. Despite months of acceptance from some, there were still those who turned away when they passed. Yet tonight felt different. Possibility hung in the air like the scent of pine. When the time came for carols, Ivy rose from her seat, her legs trembling slightly. Brian squeezed her hand in encouragement. She made her way to the front, where a small piano waited. The church fell silent as she began to sing Silent Night. Her voice, clear and strong, filled every corner of the small building. When the first verse ended, she paused, then began again, this time in Apache, using the words Morning Star had carefully taught her. The effect was immediate and profound. Settlers and native families alike sat transfixed as the familiar melody carried unfamiliar words heavenward. Tears gleamed in many eyes, including those of the preacher who had once condemned her marriage. In that moment, it seemed as though all the invisible walls between peoples began to crumble, if only briefly. The song ended, and for several heartbeats, complete silence held the church in thrall. Then someone began to clap, and others joined in until the sound was like thunder. Brian stood at his seat, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face as he gazed at his wife with pure adoration. After the service, people gathered around Ivy, not to mock or judge, but to express their wonder at her performance. Even those who had been coldest to her seemed touched by the beauty of the moment. The snow was falling again as Brian and Ivy made their way home by lantern light. Their boots crunched softly in the fresh powder, and their breath made clouds in the cold air. Ivy held tight to Brian's arm, her heart so full it felt ready to burst. "Brian," she whispered, watching the snowflakes dance in the lantern's glow. "I never thought I'd find a place where I truly belonged. But here, with you, with our neighbors, with the children who come to learn, I finally feel at home." Brian pulled her closer as they walked, his strong arm protective around her shoulders. The ranch lights glowed ahead of them through the gently falling snow, a beacon of warmth and belonging in the vast frontier night. New Year's Day of 1879 dawned brittle and cold over the Santa Fe territory. Frost traced delicate patterns across the cabin windows, and the morning air bit sharp enough to steal breath. Brian stood at the door, wrapping his heavy wool scarf tight as he prepared to ride into town for supplies. "You sure you will be fine?" he asked Ivy, who stood nearby with a shawl pulled close around her shoulders. "Ramon will be here," she assured him, though something in her heart fluttered uneasily. "We will manage the morning chores and perhaps bake bread if the kitchen stays warm enough." Brian's dark eyes softened as he looked at her. I should return. By afternoon, the passes are clear despite the cold. He touched her cheek gently before stepping out into the crystalline morning. Ivy watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and rode out, his broad figure growing smaller against the pale winter sky. Ramon appeared beside her, carrying firewood. Come, Signora, he said kindly. The animals need feeding, and work will keep us warm. They spent the morning tending to the ranch's needs, feeding chickens, checking on the cattle in the closest pasture, and ensuring the water troughs had not frozen over. By midday, the kitchen was indeed warm enough for baking, and the scent of fresh bread filled the cabin. Meanwhile, in town, activity stirred at the telegraph office. The operator's fingers flew across the brass key, receiving an urgent message. The railroad agent stood watching, a satisfied smile spreading across his face as the message was transcribed. His plan was falling into place. Days passed in tense, quiet. Then, one afternoon, the stagecoach arrived in a cloud of dust and jangling harness bells. Among its passengers stepped a man whose face bore the hard lines of bitterness and drink. Ivy's father. Word spread through town like wildfire. Shopkeepers whispered behind counters, and women gathered in doorways to watch as the man made his way to the railroad office. Inside, he met with the agent, their heads bent close in conspiracy. You'll be well compensated for your testimony, the agent assured him, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. Just stick to the story we discussed. Your daughter was taken, against her will, by the Apache rancher. As her father, you never gave consent for the marriage. Ivy's father pocketed the money with a grunt. Ain't no story needed. That worthless girl belongs under my roof until I say otherwise. Should never have let her come west in the first place. The next morning, Ivy was gathering eggs when she heard horses approaching. Her heart stopped as she recognized her father's voice calling out harshly, "Girl, get out here." She emerged from the chicken coop to find him dismounting in the yard, his face twisted with anger. The railroad agent and two other men waited on horseback behind him. Father? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Why are you here? To put an end to this nonsense, he spat. You think you can run off and marry without my permission? You're coming home where you belong. No, Ivy said, straightening her spine despite her trembling. This is my home now. Brian is my husband. I'm happy here. Her father's laugh was cruel. Happy? Look at you, still fat as ever, playing at being a rancher's wife. You owe me obedience, girl. Or have you forgotten everything you were taught? She has learned far more than you ever taught her, came Ramon's steady voice as he stepped out of the barn, his presence reassuring. The railroad agent cleared his throat. Miss, your father has filed a legal complaint. As you are underage, your marriage to Brian White Cloud is invalid. You'll need to return to Missouri with your father. Ivy's world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. No, she repeated, stronger this time. I won't go back. You can't make me. We'll see about that, her father growled, taking a threatening step forward. Ramon moved to stand between them. The center will return soon, he said firmly. Best you wait to discuss this with him present. The standoff was broken by the sound of wagon wheels. Heads turned to see several of the town women approaching, led by Sarah Miller. They had seen the men ride out and followed, concerned. What's all this then? Sarah called out, climbing down from her wagon. The other women clustered behind her, their faces showing both worry and determination. Ivy's father turned his glare on them. This ain't your business, ladies. Any threat to one of our own is our business, Sarah replied coolly. Ivy here has become dear to this community. Perhaps you'd like to explain yourself to all of us? The railroad agent shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. This public confrontation wasn't part of his plan. We'll return when Brian White Cloud is present, he said smoothly. Come, gentlemen. They rode away, leaving Ivy shaking in the yard. The women surrounded her immediately, offering comfort and support. Sarah kept one eye on the retreating men. Don't you worry, dear, she said. We won't let them take you anywhere you don't want to go. That evening, the cabin was quiet save for the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. Ivy had barely touched her supper, her stomach too knotted with fear to eat. Brian sat beside her, his face grave as he considered their situation. I won't let them take you, he said finally. his voice low but firm. "You are my wife in all the ways that matter to God and to our hearts." Ivy looked up at him, tears threatening to spill. "But what can we do? The agent said the law won't recognize our marriage because of my age. And my father," she shuddered at the memory of his cruel face. Brian reached across the table to take her hand. "The law may not be on our side," he admitted heavily. "But you have chosen your path. You are no longer a child to be commanded, but a woman who has built a life here. We will find a way." Ramon, who had been silent until now, spoke up from his place by the fire. "The people of the town, they have seen your goodness, Signora. Many will stand with us. Even those who once turned away have been touched by your kindness." Ivy squeezed Brian's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Outside, the winter wind moaned around the cabin corners, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the uncertainty in their hearts. Snow blanketed Santa Fe as townspeople hurried through the bitter January morning toward the courthouse. The wooden steps creaked under their boots as they filed inside, stamping off snow and whispering among themselves. The high-ceilinged courtroom slowly filled with spectators, eager to witness the proceedings that would determine Brian and Ivy's fate. Brian sat straight-backed at the defendant's table, his face carefully composed despite the weight pressing down on his shoulders. His dark eyes followed Ivy as she was led to her seat, separated from him by the court bailiff. She looked small and pale in her best dress, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The territorial judge entered, his black robe sweeping behind him as he took his place at the bench. The room rose, then settled into tense silence as he called the court to order. "We are here today," the judge announced, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, "to address serious allegations regarding the marriage of Brian Whitecloud and Miss Ivy Henderson, as well as associated matters of property rights." Ivy's father rose first to testify, his Sunday suit unable to hide his usual swagger. He gripped the witness rail with tobacco-stained fingers, casting disapproving glances at his daughter. "I never gave permission for this marriage," he declared, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "She was sent west to work as a companion to my sister, nothing more. This man," he jabbed a finger toward Brian, "took advantage of a naive child. Kidnapped her, if you ask me." The railroad's lawyer, sleek in an expensive suit, pressed him further. "And your daughter's age at the time?" 17, Ivy's father replied. "Still legally under my authority." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Brian's jaw tightened, but he remained still, remembering Ivy's words about choosing peace over anger. When Ivy was called to testify, she rose on shaking legs. The clerk swore her in, and she gripped the witness stand as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Please tell the court how you came to be in New Mexico territory," the railroad's lawyer prompted. Tears welled in Ivy's eyes, but her voice stayed steady. "My father put me on the train. He said I was," she swallowed hard, "a burden, that I ate too much and no one would want me. He said his sister needed help, but when I arrived, there was only Brian's advertisement for a bride." "And did you agree to this marriage willingly?" "Not at first," Ivy admitted. "I was scared and confused. But Brian," her voice strengthened as she looked at him, "Brian showed me kindness when everyone else showed scorn. He gave me a home, purpose, respect. I choose him now, freely and completely." "Your Honor," she pleaded, turning to the judge, "I may be young, but I know my own heart. This is where I belong." The judge's expression remained impassive. "While your sentiments are noted, Miss Henderson, the law is clear regarding marriage of minors without parental consent." The railroad's lawyer rose again, straightening his vest. "Your Honor, given that this marriage is clearly invalid, we must address the matter of property rights. Mr. Whitecloud's land claim is contingent upon his status as a married settler. With no legal marriage, the land should revert to government control for public auction." Gasps and angry mutters filled the courtroom. Brian's hands clenched beneath the table, but he forced them to relax, remembering Ivy's tears when she'd begged him not to fight with violence. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "we request that Miss Henderson be removed to appropriate guardianship until this matter is resolved. The Mission House for Young Ladies has offered to board her temporarily." "No," Ivy cried out, rising from her seat. "Please, Your Honor, you can't." The judge's gavel cracked against wood, Order. Miss Henderson, control yourself. He shuffled through his papers, then looked up with stern authority. Given the circumstances, I have no choice but to rule this marriage invalid under territorial law. Miss Henderson will be remanded to the mission house until proper guardianship is determined. The courtroom erupted in shocked voices. 2 deputies moved toward Ivy, who began to weep openly. Brian, she called out as they took her arms. Please, don't let them. Silence. The judge commanded. Remove Miss Henderson to the mission house immediately. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning, when we will address the matter of property rights. Brian stood, his hands gripping the table edge as he watched helplessly while Ivy was led away. Her sobs echoed in the high-ceilinged room, cutting straight to his heart. But he remembered her words about mercy being stronger than force, about building bridges instead of walls. Fighting now would only prove his enemies right. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving Brian standing alone in the sudden quiet. Dust motes danced in the pale winter light streaming through the windows, and somewhere outside, a horse nickered. The sound reminded him of home, the home he and Ivy had built together, now threatening to slip away like snow melting in the sun. Ramon appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. Sinner, he said softly, come. Standing here will not help her now. Brian's shoulders slumped slightly, but he straightened them again with effort. Without a word, he followed his friend out into the bitter January afternoon, leaving behind an empty courtroom that still seemed to echo with Ivy's tears. The mission house for young ladies loomed dark against the starlit sky, its windows gleaming like cold eyes in the January night. Inside, Ivy lay rigid on a narrow iron bed, the thin blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The room felt empty and strange, nothing like the warm cabin she'd come to call home. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting shadows on the bare wooden floor. Ivy closed her eyes, remembering Brian's gentle hands helping her down from his wagon that first day, how he'd silenced the town's cruel laughter with quiet dignity. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered into the darkness. Dear Lord, she prayed softly, please give us strength. Help Brian keep faith. Show us your path through this valley. Miles away at the ranch, Brian dismounted his horse with stiff movements, his body tense with unexpressed rage. The empty cabin seemed to mock him. No lamp in the window, no smell of cooking, no sound of Ivy humming as she worked. He clenched his fists, the urge to ride back to town and fight burning in his chest. Ramon emerged from the shadows of the barn, his weathered face creased with concern. He carried 2 tin cups of coffee, steam rising in the cold night air. Sitting alone with anger helps no one, amigo, he said, pressing 1 cup into Brian's hand. The law took her. The law must give her back. Brian's jaw tightened. The law serves those with money and power. Then we must be smarter than them. Ramon gestured toward the cabin. Come, I have an idea. Inside, Ramon lit the lamp while Brian slumped at the table, his coffee untouched. The old vaquero pulled a leather satchel from beneath his bunk, withdrawing carefully preserved papers. Your father's treatise, Ramon explained, spreading the yellowed documents on the table. And your grandfather's before him. The answers we need may lie in these words. Brian straightened, hope flickering in his dark eyes. You kept these all these years? Ramon nodded. Your father asked me to guard them. Now they may guard you. Days crept by in tense silence. At the mission house, Ivy refused to let despair claim her. She noticed young children from poor families, lingering in the street outside, watching the fancy girls at their lessons through the windows. With permission from the stern-faced matron, she began offering reading lessons in the parlor each afternoon. Word spread quickly. Soon the parlor filled with children, miners' daughters in patched dresses, ranch hand sons with dirt-stained knees. Ivy's gentle voice guided them through their letters, just as she had done at Brian's ranch. That's right, Tommy, she encouraged a small boy struggling with his primer. Sound it out slowly, like we practiced. The matron watched from the doorway, her expression softening despite herself. Even some of the town mothers who had once mocked Ivy began stopping by, drawn by their children's excited chatter about Miss Ivy's stories. Mrs. Peterson, who had sneered loudest at Ivy's size that first day at the train station, now sat in a corner of the parlor, listening as Ivy taught her youngest to read. You have a gift with them, she admitted quietly one afternoon. "We were." "Wrong about you, dear." Ivy managed a small smile, though her heart ached. "Thank you, ma'am. Though I'd trade any gift to be home with my husband." Back at the ranch, Brian and Ramon spent long nights poring over the old treaties by lamplight. Their fingers traced faded ink, searching for any clause that might protect Brian's right to the land and to Ivy. "Here," Ramon said one evening, tapping a dusty page. "This section speaks of marriage rights between tribes and settlers. And this one," he shuffled another document forward, "details property guarantees for mixed households." Brian leaned closer, hope kindling in his chest. "If we can prove the railroad's claim violates these treaties..." "Exactly." Raymond's eyes gleamed. "They think to use the law against you. But these treaties are law too. Older law, written in blood and honor." Each night, Brian rode to the edge of town, as close to the mission house as he dared. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of lamplight in Ivy's window, and his heart clenched knowing she was so near, yet unreachable. One evening, he saw a small figure slip out the mission house door. Tommy, one of Ivy's students. The boy ran to Brian's horse, holding up a folded paper. "Miss Ivy asked me to give you this," he whispered, then darted away into the gathering dusk. Brian unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Ivy's neat handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Brian, I pray for you every night. The children here remind me of our evenings at home, teaching by lamplight. I miss you more than words can say. But I won't lose hope. God brought us together for a purpose greater than spite or greed. Hold fast to faith, my love. I am doing the same. Forever yours, Ivy." Brian pressed the paper to his chest, feeling its warmth like a promise. He tucked it carefully inside his shirt before turning his horse toward home. The fury that had burned in him began to transform into something stronger, determination tempered by wisdom. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Brian and Ramon worked with renewed purpose, spreading treaties and land records across the cabin table. Their lamp burned late into the night, two men fighting injustice not with guns, but with the patient power of truth. In her narrow bed at the mission house, Ivy felt that same resolve growing in her heart. She closed her eyes, picturing Brian's face, remembering his words about dignity being stronger than force. Her prayers rose like smoke in the darkness, carrying hope toward tomorrow's light. Heavy snow blanketed the Santa Fe territory, transforming the rugged landscape into a pristine white expanse. Inside his cabin, Brian hunched over the wooden table, its surface barely visible beneath scattered treaties and land documents. The lamp's flame cast dancing shadows as his fingers traced lines of faded text, searching for answers. Ramon stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. The aroma filled the quiet cabin as Brian suddenly straightened, his breath catching. "Ramon," he called, voice tight with excitement. "Come look at this." The old vaquero set down his spoon and moved to peer over Brian's shoulder. Brian's finger rested on a paragraph in an 1854 treaty. "Here," Brian said, reading aloud. "Land rights granted to tribal members through proper channels shall remain inviolate regardless of subsequent marriage status or tribal affiliation." He looked up at Ramon, eyes bright. "This treaty predates the railroad's claims. They can't void my deed just because they don't like who I married." Ramon squeezed Brian's shoulder. "Your father was wise to preserve these papers. The old words still have power." Brian carefully folded the treaty, hands trembling slightly. "We need to show this to Judge Parker. Even he can't ignore a binding federal treaty." Meanwhile, across town, the mission house parlor hummed with activity. Ivy sat in her usual chair by the window, helping Tommy sound out words from his primer. Several other children sprawled on the rug around her feet, working on their letters. Mrs. Peterson watched from her corner seat, noting how Ivy's patience never wavered, how she found ways to reach even the most stubborn learners. When Tommy finally read a full sentence without help, Ivy's face lit up with genuine joy. "Well done," she praised, and the boy beamed. After the lesson, Mrs. Peterson lingered, fidgeting with her shawl. "Miss Ivy," she began hesitantly, "I want you to know, some of us mothers have been talking." Ivy's heart skipped, fearing more criticism. But Mrs. Peterson continued, "We've seen how you are with our children, how you've brought learning and kindness to this town. It ain't right what they're doing to you and Brian." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "We've started a petition, asking Judge Parker to grant you early emancipation, seeing as you're clearly capable of managing your own affairs and choosing your own husband." Ivy's hand shook as she took the paper. Neat rows of signatures filled the page. Mothers, teachers, even the mission house matron herself. Tears welled in her eyes as she read name after name. "You do this for me?" she whispered. Mrs. Peterson touched her arm gently. "We were wrong about you, dear. Dead wrong. And we aim to make it right." Ivy pressed the petition to her chest, tears flowing freely now. Women who had once mocked her size, her clothes, her very presence in their town, now stood as allies. The magnitude of the support overwhelmed her. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the snow-covered streets, Brian arrived at the mission house for his supervised visit. The matron led him to the parlor where Ivy waited, keeping a watchful eye from her chair by the door. Though they couldn't touch, couldn't even sit close together, the love between them filled the space. Brian's eyes softened as they met Ivy's, noting the hope that had replaced despair on her face. "The mothers," Ivy whispered, barely containing her excitement. "They're petitioning for my emancipation. Mrs. Peterson brought it herself." Brian nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "God works in mysterious ways, and I found something too." He glanced at the matron before continuing quietly, "An old treaty that protects our land rights. The railroad can't take what's legally mine, no matter whom I marry." Ivy's eyes shone in the flickering lamplight. "Then we'll win this fight?" "We'll win," Brian agreed. "Not through force or anger, but through truth and law." "That's the only way victory matters," Ivy said softly. "We will win by truth, not rage." The lantern flames wavered, casting warm light across their faces as they shared this moment of hope. Though they sat apart, their hearts beat as one, strengthened by the knowledge that justice and community now stood with them. Brian watched Ivy's face in the gentle light, seeing not the scared girl who had stumbled off the train months ago, but a strong woman who had won over an entire town through nothing more than kindness and grace. His chest swelled with pride and love. The matron cleared her throat, signaling the visit's end. As Brian rose to leave, he caught Ivy's eye one last time. No words were needed. Their shared look held all their determination, all their faith in each other and in God's plan. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, each flake a promise of renewal. Inside the warmth of the mission house parlor, Ivy touched the pocket where the mother's petition lay safely folded, while Brian's treaty waited in his saddlebag to bring truth to light. Together yet apart, they held fast to hope, knowing that justice would prevail through patience, dignity, and the power of transformed hearts. January's bitter wind howled through Santa Fe's streets as the railroad agent strode from door to door, his polished boots crunching in day-old snow. At each home, he painted dark pictures of life at Brian's ranch, hinting at cruelty and savage customs that made townsfolk shudder. "That poor girl," women whispered in kitchens, "locked away all those months, forced to work like a slave." But Sarah Miller, whose son Tommy had learned his letters from Ivy, stood up at the general store. "That's nonsense," she declared. "My boy visited that ranch near every day. Miss Ivy was treated like a queen, teaching children and keeping fine books." The railroad agent's lies found fertile ground in the preacher's next sermon. He stood rigid in his pulpit, face flushed with righteous anger. "Consider the girl's soul," he thundered. "Living among heathens, far from Christian influence. We must save her from this ungodly arrangement." Yet even as his words rang out, Martha Wilson, the cooper's wife, gathered her children and walked out, head held high. 3 other families followed. In the back pew, Mrs. Peterson clutched her petition tighter, jaw set with determination. Tension finally erupted at the town meeting hall one frosty evening. Oil lamps cast long shadows as the railroad agent addressed the packed room, his voice smooth as silk. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "we cannot allow this mockery of marriage to stand. Think of the precedent it sets. Why, soon every savage will claim, 'You watch your mouth.'" Tommy Miller jumped up, all of 12 years old but fierce as a mountain lion. "Miss Ivy ain't nobody's victim. She taught me to read when nobody else could." His mother tried to shush him, but other children stood too. Jenny Peterson, Lucy Cooper, the Williams twins, all Ivy's former pupils. She's kind. She knows stories. She never laughs at mistakes. Their young voices rang with conviction, drowning out the agent's practiced speech. The railroad man's face darkened as he lost control of the room. Near the back, several men fingered their gun belts, tension crackling. But before violence could erupt, Ramon stepped forward, his weathered face calm. "These children speak truth," he said simply. "Why do you fear such goodness?" His quiet words seemed to break the spell. The armed men looked away, ashamed. The railroad agent stormed out, leaving his speech unfinished. Meanwhile, Brian rode through the deepening winter afternoon toward the courthouse. Snow had begun falling again, but he barely noticed the cold. Inside his coat, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay the treaty documents, his strongest weapon against the railroad's greed. The clerk looked up in surprise as Brian's tall frame filled the doorway. Snow melted from his shoulders as he carefully unwrapped the papers. "I demand a proper hearing," Brian said, laying the treaties on the desk. "These documents prove my land rights are protected, regardless of my marriage." The clerk adjusted his spectacles, scanning the aged papers. His eyebrows
rose as he read.
This appears to be in order. I'll need to schedule. Now." Brian's voice was quiet but firm. Too much harm has already been done by delay. Across town in her small boarding house room, Ivy knelt beside her narrow bed. The floorboards were hard against her knees, but she barely noticed. Her heart was too full of prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "give me words of truth when I must speak. Let me be brave, not for myself, but for all who need to see your love can bridge any divide." She touched the worn Bible Brian had given her, drawing strength from its familiar leather binding. Outside her window, winter storms gathered, delaying travel and court proceedings. But even the weather couldn't stop justice forever. Finally, word came. Judge Parker had set the decisive trial for the first week of February. The courthouse would decide not just Ivy and Brian's fate, but whether love could truly overcome prejudice in Santa Fe territory. That evening, Mrs. Peterson visited Ivy's room, bringing a fresh-baked loaf of bread and news from town. She found Ivy calm, almost serene despite the approaching trial. "Ain't you scared, child?" she asked, settling into the room's single chair. Ivy smiled, breaking the warm bread to share. "I was scared when I first came west," she admitted. Scared. Of Brian, scared of being different, scared of failing. But now? She looked out at the swirling snow. "Now I know who I am. And I know what's right." Mrs. Peterson reached over to squeeze her hand. "We'll all be there," she promised. "Every mother whose child you've taught, every soul you've touched with kindness. You won't stand alone." Through the thin walls, they could hear the wind's mournful song. But inside, the small room was warm with the scent of fresh bread and the strength of friendship. Forged in adversity's fire. Dawn broke pale and silent over Santa Fe on the morning of February 7th, 1879. Fresh snow blanketed the streets in pristine white, muffling the usual sounds of the awakening town. Footprints marked the path to the courthouse as townspeople trudged through knee-deep drifts, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Inside the courthouse, oil lamps cast a warm glow across polished wooden benches. The room filled quickly despite the early hour. Mothers who had signed the petition sat together, their children fidgeting beside them. Sarah Miller smoothed her best dress, whispering quiet prayers. Tommy, her son, clutched his primer, the one Ivy had used to teach him reading. Brian entered. Alone, his tall frame dignified in a clean black coat. He carried a leather portfolio containing the precious treaty documents. His face remained composed, though his eyes constantly searched the doorway. When Ivy finally appeared, escorted by Mrs. Peterson, his expression softened for just a moment before returning to its careful mask. Ivy wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly braided. She walked with surprising grace, head held high despite the whispers that followed her. The weeks in the boarding house had not broken her spirit. If anything, she seemed stronger, more certain of herself. The railroad's legal team swept in like a storm, 3 sharp-suited lawyers led by the railroad agent himself. They spread papers across their table with theatrical flourish, shooting triumphant glances toward Brian. Their confidence filled the air like smoke. Judge Parker entered, his black robe swishing against the floor. The room rose, then settled into tense silence as he took his seat. His weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the crowded courtroom. This court will hear arguments regarding the validity of land claims and marriage rights, he announced, voice clear and firm. Railroad interests may present first. The lead lawyer rose, straightening his expensive vest. Your Honor, the facts are simple. This land was designated for railroad expansion by federal mandate. Any prior claims are void, especially those based on an invalid marriage to a minor. He gestured dramatically toward Ivy. This arrangement cannot stand in the way of progress. For the next hour, the lawyers argued loudly, waving contracts and maps. They cited precedents, federal laws, and progress's demands. Their voices grew hoarse with righteous certainty. When they finished, Judge Parker turned to Brian. Your response? Brian stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He opened his portfolio and withdrew the treaty documents with careful hands. Your Honor, these papers show the truth. My land rights were established by treaty in 1854 before any railroad claims. The terms are clear. These rights stand regardless of marriage status. He approached the bench, spreading the yellowed pages before the judge. His voice remained steady, though his hands trembled slightly. I have honored every term of this treaty. I have farmed this land, raised cattle, paid taxes. I have built a home where two cultures can live in peace. Peace. The judge studied the documents intently, adjusting his spectacles. The railroad lawyers shifted uneasily in their seats. And what of the marriage question? Judge Parker asked, looking up. For that, Brian said quietly, I asked the court to hear. My wife. All eyes turned to Ivy as she rose. She smoothed her skirts and walked to the witness stand, each step echoing in the hushed room. After taking the oath, she faced the judge directly. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and strong. I came west against my will, sent by a father who saw me only as a burden. But God had other plans. She glanced at Brian, drawing strength from his presence. I found purpose here. I found respect. Most importantly, I found a man who sees me as I truly am, not a burden, but a blessing. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I choose him, Ivy continued, her chin lifting. I choose this life, this land, these people. I am not a victim to be rescued. I am his wife. Before the judge could respond, Mrs. Peterson stood, clutching a thick sheaf of papers. Your Honor, if I may? At his nod, she approached the bench. These are signatures from every mother whose children Ivy has taught. We petition for her emancipation, having witnessed her capability and character. The railroad agent jumped to his feet. Objection. This is highly irregular. So noted. Judge Parker cut him off, accepting the petition. He spent long minutes reading through the pages while the courtroom held its breath. Finally, he set the papers down and surveyed the room. The oil lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow continued to fall in gentle. Silence. The law must serve justice, not merely progress, he began slowly. I find the treaty rights valid and binding. The railroad's claim is denied. He raised his hand as the railroad lawyers began to protest. Furthermore, having reviewed the petition and witnessed Miss Ivy's testimony, I grant her petition for emancipation. Her marriage to Brian stands legal and binding. For a moment, perfect stillness held the room. Then cheers erupted, drowning out the railroad agent's furious objections. Tommy Miller whooped and waved his primer in the air. Women embraced, crying happy tears. Even the court clerk smiled as he recorded the judgment. Brian stood motionless, overwhelmed by the victory. But when Ivy flew to his side, he gathered her close, treaty papers crushed between them. His whispered thank you was lost in the joyful chaos, but Ivy heard it in the trembling of his arms. The railroad lawyers stormed out, defeat bitter on their faces. Their agent paused in the doorway, glaring at the celebrating crowd. But nobody noticed his departure. They were too busy surrounding Brian and Ivy with congratulations and blessings. Mrs. Peterson's voice rose above the happy tumult. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but always toward justice. Judge Parker watched it all from his bench, a slight smile softening his stern features. Perhaps, he thought, progress wasn't always measured in railroad ties and telegraph wires. Sometimes it came in smaller moments, in a young woman's courage, in a community's changing heart, in love that bridged the deepest divides. The third Sunday of February dawned bright and clear over Santa Fe. Morning sunlight sparkled off melting icicles that hung from the white-painted church eaves. Inside, golden light streamed through frost-edged windows, warming the wooden pews where townsfolk gathered in their Sunday best. Brian stood at the altar in a new black suit, his silver watch chain gleaming. His hands, usually rough from ranch work, were scrubbed clean. Though his expression remained composed, those who knew him well could see the joy in his dark eyes as he watched the church doors dot when Ivy appeared in the doorway. A collective sigh rippled through the congregation. She wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Peterson and the other women had worked on secretly, adding delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her brown hair was braided with white ribbons, and she carried a small bouquet of winter greenery and dried flowers from Brian's greenhouse. Unlike her first arrival in Santa Fe 6 months ago, no mocking whispers followed her progress down the aisle. Instead, smiles bloomed across familiar faces. Tommy Miller waved from his seat, and his mother quickly caught his hand, though she was smiling too. Even the preacher who had once condemned their union now stood ready to formally bless it, his stern face softened by the undeniable rightness of the moment. As Ivy reached Brian's side, she lifted her chin with quiet pride. Her body was still plump, but she no longer tried to make herself smaller. The past months had taught her that worth wasn't measured in inches or pounds, but in love given and received. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice carrying to the farthest corner of the church, "we are gathered here today to witness what God has already joined together." The ceremony itself was simple and sweet. Brian's deep voice never wavered as he repeated his vows. When Ivy spoke her promises, her words rang clear and true. The gold rings they exchanged caught the morning light, symbols of a love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the preacher declared. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Before he could finish saying, "You may kiss your bride," the congregation burst into spontaneous applause. Brian kissed Ivy gently, then drew back to beam at her with unrestrained happiness. They turned to face their neighbors and friends, no longer divided by prejudice or fear. After the ceremony, the churchyard became a festival of celebration. Settler women proudly displayed their best pies, apple and peach, cherry and blackberry, arranged on long tables beneath the trees. Children darted between adults' legs, playing tag in their Sunday clothes while their mothers called half-hearted warnings. From the Apache settlement came Brian's extended family, bearing traditional gifts. His aunt presented Ivy with a beautifully woven blanket, its patterns telling stories of harmony between earth and sky. His cousins brought pottery filled with seeds for spring planting, symbols of new beginnings and growth. Even those who had once been skeptical found themselves caught up in the joy. Old Mr. Henderson, who had initially grumbled about improper unions, was seen enjoying a slice of Mrs. Miller's apple pie while chatting amiably with Ramon about cattle prices. Afternoon sun was lowering when Brian and Ivy finally climbed into their wagon for the ride home. Rice and flower petals showered down around them, tossed by laughing children. Ivy clutched her bouquet and blanket close, overwhelmed by the outpouring of acceptance and love. As they drove through the quiet winter landscape toward their ranch, neither felt the need to break the peaceful silence. The setting sun painted the snow-dusted mesas in shades of rose and gold. A pair of hawks circled overhead, their wings catching the last rays of daylight. At home, lamplight welcomed them through the cabin windows. Inside, the table was set with their best dishes, a wedding gift from the town mothers. Brian lit the lamps while Ivy hung her cream dress carefully in the wardrobe. She changed into her familiar blue dress, then joined him at the table. There, supper was simple: fresh bread, roasted chicken, and winter vegetables from their root cellar. But as they bowed their heads to pray, both felt the profound richness of the moment. "Thank you, Lord," Brian murmured, "for your mercy that brought us together, for neighbors turned to friends, for justice that prevails. And most of all," he looked across at Ivy, his eyes soft with love, for sending me a wife whose worth far exceeds any measure." Ivy's eyes glistened as she added her own quiet amen. Looking around their warm kitchen at the mixed blessings of both cultures that had come together to celebrate their love, she felt complete. This was home, not just the physical cabin, but the life she and Brian had built together. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had stumbled off a train 6 months ago, seeking escape from shame. Here, in this place, with this man, she had found not just acceptance but celebration. Her sighs, once a source of mockery, now seemed as irrelevant as last summer's dust. They finished their supper unhurried, savoring each bite and each moment together. Through the window, stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting now shone down on their formal union, blessed by law and community alike. In the quiet of their kitchen, surrounded by the simple gifts of food and fellowship, Brian and Ivy knew they had received something precious, a love strong enough to change hearts and bridge worlds. Their victory was not just legal but spiritual, marked by the transformation of an entire community from suspicion to celebration. The lamp flame flickered gently, casting warm light across their faces as they sat together, giving thanks for the miracle of belonging. The April sunrise painted the New Mexico sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Fresh grass sparkled with morning dew as Brian and Ivy prepared their ranch for the spring feast. Long tables stretched across their yard, draped with crisp white cloths that snapped in the gentle breeze. Ramon worked steadily, stringing paper lanterns between the apple trees now heavy with pink blossoms. Their soft glow would welcome the evening when it came. The air carried the mingled scents of mesquite, smoke and roasting meat, making mouths water in anticipation. By midday, wagons and horses brought families from town and the nearby settlement. Settler women laid out their dishes beside traditional Apache foods, creating a feast that bridged two worlds. Children darted between the tables, their laughter rising like music on the spring air. Mrs. Peterson's eldest daughter taught Apache children to play hopscotch while their mothers exchanged recipes over steaming dishes. The town banker sat discussing cattle prices with Brian's cousin, their earlier distrust forgotten in the warmth of shared food and conversation. As the sun began its westward slide, Ramon stood and tapped his glass for attention. His weathered face creased with joy as he raised a toast. "I have seen much hatred in my years," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "But I have never seen courage like these two showed us. Not the courage of fists or guns, but the courage of mercy. They taught us all a better way." Brian rose next, drawing Ivy close to his side. "This woman saved more than my heart," he declared. "She saved my land with her wisdom and our community with her kindness. God sent me not just a wife, but a light to guide us all." Tears sparkled in Ivy's eyes as she looked out over the gathered faces that had once mocked her, now smiling with genuine affection. Lifting her voice, she began to sing. The hymn floated first in English, then shifted smoothly into Apache words she had practiced through the winter months. As dusk deepened, Brian's arms settled around her shoulders. Together they watched their guests mingle beneath the glowing lanterns, children still playing in the last rays of light. The land was wakening to spring, and with it, their community bloomed into something new and beautiful, a place where hope grew strong enough to bridge any divide. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe, and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.